the United Nations Charter in 1945, is challenging a decades-long narrative around who was responsible for the fundamental rights gained by women in the landmark document. And Algerian and Norwegian researchers with London School of Oriental and African Studies are challenging current thinking that Western delegates, particularly former US First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt, were mainly responsible for including the specific mention of women's rights in the Charter. Women and the UN Charter, a Southern legacy, focuses on the pivotal contributions of Latin American women to the Charter, and particularly a female delegate from Brazil.
It's regarded as the birthplace of the United Nations, and its foundational charter, crafted by 850 delegates representing 80% of the world's population, the first international document that explicitly mentions the equal rights of men and women.
If you ask who do we have to thank to have Article 8 in the UN Charter, who do we have to thank to have gender equality in the agenda of the UN, it's a lot of people will bring up the name maybe of Eleanor Roosevelt, but not a lot of people would know about Berta Lutz.
Brazilian politician and women's rights advocate Dr. Berta Lutz emerges along with colleagues from Latin America as a critical figure in successfully including specific reference to women's rights in the Charter, despite opposition from other delegates, many of them women from the more developed world, notably the United States and Britain at the time. She is one of just 4 women to sign the document and critically also proposed amendments to the Charter that led to the establishment of the Commission on the Status of Women. Article 8 of the Charter says the UN shall place no restrictions on the eligibility of men and women to participate in the body's organs. The Charter's preamble, authored in part by former South African Prime Minister Jan Smuts, also refers to the equal rights of men and women. The authors hoping to debunk the narrative that the noble ideals of the Charter, particularly on gender equality, were only Western constructs.
It matters because it's an example of how history is presented is political, and it doesn't really necessarily present all the true accounts of what really happened. And it's also a part of a bigger tendencies that if good ideas are found outside the West, they're often dismissed or seen as imitation. And this is why the contribution of the Global South in the founding of the UN has generally been ignored and neglected. And neglecting the contribution of Berta Lutz is a part of a wider tendency, neglecting contributions of women in international relations, and particularly the fundamental Southern contributions to global norms such as human rights and gender equality.
Most striking was how their research discovered that while women represented just 3% of the 850 delegates to San Francisco, the strongest opposition to their goals came from women themselves.
The West was actually opposed to have gender equality in the agenda, but they actually did everything to have women's rights removed from Article 8. So there is this very funny anecdote where the US, so back to the memoir of Berta Lutz, she says how the US delegate, Virginia Gildersleeve, invited her for tea, and she, during the conversation, she tells her very explicitly that she hopes that Berta Lutz was not going to ask for anything for women in the Charter, since that would be a very vulgar thing to do.
We stand today at the threshold of a great event.
And while Eleanor Roosevelt's contributions to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights are widely acknowledged, it was women from the South who too were forebearers of the struggle for women's empowerment and equality that continues to this day. Bryce-Pease, SABC News, New York.